So, my name is Morgan Hunt, and I'll be doing my presentation on B.F. Skinner. A little bit about his personal life. Skinner was born on March 20th, 1904, in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. His father was a lawyer, mother was a housewife, and then he had one younger brother. He grew up in a pretty stable, loving home. Starting as a child, he was pretty innovative, and he enjoyed building and inventing things. A few examples was a cabin in the woods with his friends, a berry separator for his door-to-door business, and then a contraption to make sweeping easier at his high school job. In 1936, he married Yvonne Blue, and together they had two daughters, Julie and Deborah. And then sadly, he passed away on August 18th in 1990 from leukemia, which he was diagnosed the previous year. So a little bit about his education. In high school, he enjoyed reading and spent a lot of time with books. He took an English class taught by Mrs. Graves, who he later dedicated his book, The Technology of Teaching. And then he attended Hamilton College in New York to study literature. This is where he discovered an interest in writing. He had a career in writing for only a few years. It didn't really work out for him. So he also worked a job as a bookstore clerk. And at this job is where he was introduced to the work of Pavlov and Watson, which intrigued him and sparked his interest in the field of behaviorism. Following his time there, he attended Harvard for grad school to study psychology. He did research under William Crozer. He was a mentor for him, who he found very similar to himself. Crozer was from the physiology department and was interested in studying the behavior of the animal as a whole rather than just the mental process. This fascinated Skinner, and it definitely matched his goals of relating behavior to experimental conditions. So a little timeline of the jobs that he held. So first, obviously, the bookstore clerk was the start of his behaviorist ideas. Then in 1933 to 1936, he was a junior fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows. And then in 1936, he joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota. And then in 1945, he was the chair of psychology department at Indiana University. And then a few years later, 1948, he joined the faculty at Harvard, where he stayed until retirement in 1974. So some of his notable research and work that he completed. So in 1932, he had identified two types of conditioning, classical and operant. Then in 1938, he published The Behavior of Organisms, which established experimental behavior analysis and introduced a method for studying learning through reinforcement. Then in the 30s and 40s is when operant conditioning was formalized. So that's just the method of shaping behavior through reinforcement. Then he also developed the Skinner box, or like he liked to call experimental spaces, in the 1930s for his operant conditioning experiments, and these allowed for precise control over experiments and measurements. Then in the early 40s was the World War II Project Pigeon. Him and his students trained pigeons to guide missile systems. They believed the pigeons could be more precise than radar. The military tested the idea but scrapped the project because it was dissatisfactory. But the experiment showed how operant conditioning can train animals for complex tasks. Then in the 1940s, he also introduced the baby tender, which was an enclosed heated crib with a plexiglass window, which was developed for his daughter Deborah to have a safer crib option. Then in 1948, he published the book Walden 2, which demonstrated Skinner's desire to explore how scientific principles could be applied to real-world societies. So his work continued. In the 1950s, he developed a teaching machine which allowed students to learn at their own pace and receive immediate feedback for correct answers. In 1952, started the behavior therapy program at Metropolitan State Hospital in Massachusetts. Then in 1953, him and his team published Studies in Behavior Therapy. This work was critical in establishing behavior therapy as a viable treatment for mental health issues and was one of the first papers to reference behavior therapy. Then in the 50s, he was researching and describing reinforcement schedules, and in 1968, the Journal of Applied Behavior launched. In 1983, he co-wrote the book Enjoy Old Age with Margaret Vaughan, which offered advice on memory, sensory decline, exercise, diet, and retirement. Finally, going over his impact today. So, verbal behavior on behavior analysis. Verbal behavior principles are widely used in applied behavior analysis. Then applied behavior analysis therapy is effective in helping those with autism and developmental disorders. For reinforcement and program learning on the education system, his ideas on reinforcement and program learning have influenced the education system and behavior modification techniques. In clinical psychology, behavior therapy techniques are based on Skinner's principles and used to treat substance use disorders, phobias, and other behavioral issues. For operant learning, Skinner realized that the laws of operant learning were extremely important for human learning and education. He made more contributions to education than any other area. Skinner's contributions to education based on operant learning have been incorporated by numerous educators and scholars into technologies with demonstrated teaching effectiveness with both typically developing children and children with special needs. These include reading programs, entire curriculum, and even schools. And here are my references.